On the night of the 17th November, for the second time during the month, Russia has hit the Islamic State terrorists with the cruise missiles. It was reported by the Reuters and Le Monde. According to them, the missiles were launched by the Russian Navy from the Mediterranean. The target was the Syrian Raqqa, which the terrorists pronounced to be the capital of the IS. A bit later, the chief of the Russian Armed Forces General Staff Valery Gerasimov confirmed that Russia applied sea and air-launched cruise missiles. Mass attack was made by submarine, ships and strategic bombers. Herewith, Moscow informed the coalition states about striking terrorists in advance. That was confirmed by the US State Department and European leaders. What's more, the Russians have developed a plan of new air operation against ISIS in Syria that predetermines strengthening of the Krebs Group and striking from the Russian territory. But there is every reason to believe that very soon a lot of Western hawks will start telling that the Russians make war not against ISIS, but a free Syrian army and civilians. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has managed to get in touch with a number of Syrian opposition leaders who appealed to Russia themselves with a request not to bomb the territory they control. And the Russians are ready to give the coalition a list of opposition groups that the Americans still refuse to do. And this is a real policy of double standards. Then France has officially admitted that it has the common targets with Russia in Syria, and the Paris government sources announced that Russia bombs exactly the ISIS position. Last days, the French and British air forces joined exterminating the terrorists. They are bombing Raqqa and Iraqi territory. At the same time, the US State Secretary John Kerry said that the American and Turkish troops begin a joint operation to get control of the last 98 kilometers of the Turkish-Syrian border. An exciting unanimity, except one thing. All that measures were preceded by several acts of terrorism, the bloodbath in Paris, numerous explosions in Beirut, and as it has become known now, bomb attack on the Russian Airbus over Sinai. There is no need for the Russians to explain how terrible the Paris acts of terrorism were. That night, the Russian reporters concluded that it was a kind of French Nord-Ost or Beslan. And the French people themselves had quickly found analogues in the Russian history. That is why social media bloomed with the photos of the President Putin and his famous words of 15 years ago.
Мы будем преследовать террористов везде. В аэропорту, значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем и в сортире их замочим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
In Russia, people were shocked and sympathized Paris. Russia has had through it many times. If someone thinks that it concerns only France, then it is a great mistake. This was a strike upon all the Europe, but for a number of reasons, it was more convenient to hurt France. First of all, there is the biggest European community of Muslims in France. This community has never been a traditional part of the state. It was imported during the last 50 years within the period of the industrial boom. The most part of the French Muslims lives in a compact suburban district similar to ghetto. As now France is a post-industrialized country, then the significant part of these semi-citizens are jobless. Today France is a country of the escalating caste conflict. The hands of this caste divide are even in the French drama movie called Intouchables. Anyway, France is not an enemy of Islam, but the part of the national ideology is laïcism that predetermines a full separation of the state and public life from religion. All of that could not help making the French Muslims a yielding auditorium for Islamic State propaganda. Therefore, it is not surprising that the terrorists who murdered 10 dozens of their so-called countrymen spoke French without accent. Moreover, it was an obvious revenge for the French air forces bombing ISIS positions in Syria and Iraqi Tikrit. The next morning, the unpopular and everlasting criticized French President Hollande addressed to the Congress in the image of a determined leader who was ready to act right away. France is at war. The attack that took place in Paris and by the Stade de France that Friday evening are the acts of war. This was an attack on our country, on our values, on our young people, on our way of life. Hollande emphasized again that the war to France was declared by the Islamic State, which must be exterminated, and it concerns all the world community. In this case, I call for the United Nations Security Council in a short time to adopt a resolution that will confirm a strong desire to fight against terrorism. The president reminded that the day before, the French air forces had hit the so-called capital of the ISIS in Raqqa and promised to increase the number of attacks in the nearest future. However, in order to beat the terrorists, all the countries that are ready to fight terrorists should unite under one banner. We need a large and united international coalition. Exactly that issues I will discuss with the President Obama in Washington and the President Putin in Moscow within a few days in order to unite our forces and to get a result that otherwise we will be waiting for years. Having felt their impunity for what they did the same day the terrorists kept on nightmarizing the international community, they put on the internet a video with the threats of new acts of terror.
We say to the states that take part in the Crusader campaign that, by God, you will have a day like France's, and as we struck France in the center of its abode in Paris, then we swear that we will strike America at its center in Washington.
Not that the relaxing Americans started to panic, but the government set special services to the code red and ready to act. According to the words of the Pentagon head Ashton Carter, the most danger for the United States from the Islamic State is the lone terrorist, which attacks cannot be predetermined. For example, one must remember the attack on the Tennessee Military Recruiting Center when 5 Marines were killed. The jihadist rhetoric can be connected with an abrupt increase of the US coalition, which last week killed the ISIS murderer Jihadi Dawn and destroyed tanker trucks transporting oil products. There is no doubt that the Islamic State has taken it as a direct challenge, or perhaps as a betrayal, since a cooperation between the United States and the terrorists had already been an open secret for a long time. Reaction of the terrorists won't be long in coming. Before that, the American companies was not dignified to buy cheap ISIS oil by means of dummy companies or roundabout way. This was directly confirmed by the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov. It's obvious that for a long time the United States Armed Forces has not attacked terrorist groups that could press the Assad's army. Confirmation of the terroristic version of the Russian Airbus crash was expected, but the statement by the Russian president has become the most memorable. The video of the evening meeting the Kremlin released only by the Tuesday afternoon. For the first time, the Russian people had seen how their president reacted to the FSB head report. Putin seemed to be both a well-known to everyone and completely new person. He was tired and upset, but at the same time angry and concentrated. It was the president declaring war.
Мы будем искать их везде, где бы они ни прятались. Мы их найдем в любой точке планеты и покараем.
Despite the Russian Air Force's operation in Syria has begun a month ago, exactly the statement Putin made on the 16th of November can be regarded as an official war declaration, helped by his reference to the Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations that provides a state with the right for self-defense. So the Russians, with their strikes on the Islamic State, have practically announced the Operation Punishment. After a phone talk with President Hollande that Putin had during the meeting in the National Defense Control Center, he proposed a direct contact with an aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle. And as the Russian proverb says, a friend in need is a friend indeed. It appears that now it's high time for France to get to know who is a real friend of theirs. There is one more interesting thing. Now that the Russians are furious, and the whole world knows how much furious the Russians can be, everyone suddenly got interested in destroying Halifat as soon as possible. For some participants of the process, there are two reasons. The first is to cover the tracks before the Russians to come and find out the truth, and the second is to compete for imperatorial laurels. That is why there is a reason to believe that there will be no united coalition to be made. There are numerous obstacles, including a challenge for the Syria future. But a coordination of actions, which Putin called for during the last United Nations General Assembly, has already taken place. The United States and France will concentrate on Iraq, where a great role is played by Iran. If the American coalition will manage to beat jihadist forces together with the Kurds, and what's more useful, together with the Iranians as well, and won't be just pushing them out to Syria, this will be a real evidence that they are ready to act in common interest to solve the problem.